So, why look at Ezra? Well, what we'll see as we work our way through the book of Ezra is there are three great truths about God run right the way through it. And they're vital truths for us to hear today. As we look at the world around us, as perhaps we despair over the state of the church, as we struggle in our own lives, as we face all kinds of suffering or temptation or sin, three wonderful truths in Ezra about God. And those three truths are, first of all, God never abandons his purpose. Secondly, God never gives up on his people. And thirdly, God gives light for the guidance of his people. And you'll see. Remember the great promises that were made to Abraham back in Genesis chapter 12, what we call, or what is called, the covenant. And you'll remember there were three parts to the covenant. The first part was the promised land, and that's in Genesis chapter 12 verse 1, where Abraham is called by God to leave Ur and go to a place known as Canaan. The land of Canaan then became known as Israel. Israel was named after Abraham's grandson and is often referred to as the promised land because God promised to give the land to the descendants. Second part of the promise was the promise of descendants. Can be found in verse 2 of Genesis chapter 12. And that's where God promises Abraham that he would make a great nation out of him. I will increase your numbers very, very much and make you into a nation. And that's when God changed Abraham's name to Abraham, meaning father of many nations. And then the third part of the covenant was the promise of blessing and redemption, found in Genesis 12 verses 1 to 3, where God promises to bless Abraham and all his descendants. Now, remember Lamentations. That was describing to us what the people found when they returned from exile. It was a land that was desolate and barren, which for an agrarian economy was a bad way. It was a land that, if you remember Deuteronomy, was promised to be flowing with milk and honey. It's gone. It's been destroyed. So how are God's people going to have this land flowing with milk and honey? And then the second part of the promised descendants and building them into a nation. Well, how's that going to happen if they're in exile, scattered by God, as we saw in Lamentations? How's God going to keep that part of the covenant if the people are in Babylon or Persia or Assyria? And then the third part of the promise was blessing and redemption. But again, we've heard in Amos and Hosea how God brings judgment when his people aren't faithful. It was the effects of that judgment that Lamentations described. And if you remember the end of Lamentations, there wasn't a great deal of hope. There wasn't sign of blessing or redemption. In fact, at the end of Lamentations, there's a great big question mark about whether there will be redemption. But we'll see in Ezra that yes, God does bring blessing. And Ezra and Nehemiah, the book that follows it, will show how God brings that redemption to his people. But most of all, we'll see God setting up a holy people whose lives are centered around him, and the blocks are being set in place for the fulfillment of the prophecies that related to the coming of the Messiah. So Ezra and Nehemiah are crucially important to seeing God keep the covenant and set up the scene for the coming of Jesus. So Ezra begins where Chronicles, and for that matter Kings, finish. Listen to this from the end of 2 Chronicles. In the first verse 22, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah, the Lord moved the heart of Cyrus, king of Persia, to make a proclamation throughout his realm, and also to put it in writing. This is what Cyrus, king of Persia, says. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem in Judah. Any of his people among you may go up, and may the Lord their God be with them. So that's the end of 2 Chronicles. Now this is the beginning of Ezra. In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah, the Lord moved the heart of Cyrus, king of Persia, to make a proclamation throughout his realm, and also to put it in writing. This is what Cyrus, king of Persia, says. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem in Judah. Any of his people among you may go up to Jerusalem. So that's the first thing. Ezra and Nehemiah were part of Chronicles. Some biblical scholars say that Chronicles, Ezra and Nehemiah were for a time all one book, but they've been separated. Then you'll see how I've referenced it with Nehemiah quite a lot, because it was originally combined with Nehemiah. Ezra describes the rebuilding of the temple. Nehemiah describes the rebuilding of the wall. And the two books together describe about 100 years of history from about 539 BC to 433 BC. But because the two different central characters, Ezra and Nehemiah, those books were split by the early church. So at the end of Chronicles and Kings, the people have been taken into exile in Babylon. The northern kingdom had fallen in 722 BC and 10 tribes had been deported. Zion, or Jerusalem, had remained until 587 BC, when the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed the city, ransacked it, and burnt the temple, and the remaining people taken to Assyria in exile. And again, the effects were graphically described in Lamentations. The city was left like a widow, Lady Zion. And the people were back where Abraham had come from, before the making of the covenant with Abraham. The land given in Exodus, described in Deuteronomy, as flowing with milk and honey, now desolate. All that history gone. However, the Babylonian Empire had fallen to the Persians, and King Cyrus is now on the Persian throne, and he issues an edict allowing the exiles to return home to build a temple in their homeland. And so the first 6 chapters of Ezra describe the first wave of exiles who returned to Judah under Zerubbabel. I'm going to have fun with his name, to rebuild the temple. And that's somewhere around about 539 BC through to 516 BC. And it's also the period where the prophet Haggai was active. Second half of the book describes a second wave who were led by Ezra himself, and that's about 50 years later. And between the two halves, the events in the book of Esther take place. So both Haggai and Esther and Zechariah as well all take place around the same period. It's also worth noting that Ezra is incredibly important to Judaism. Ezra brings to the people in Jerusalem the law, the Torah, the scriptures. He reads it to them, he interprets it for them, and that leads the people to recommit to a life of faithfulness and obedience to God. They keep their side of the covenant. And as we read Ezra, you'll find there are many Mosaic connections. He draws on Joshua a lot to justify the return. And we've seen how it will fulfill God's covenant promises. So in Judaism, Ezra is seen as a kind of second Moses, although it's worth noting that according to Numbers chapter 1 verse 46, there were about 3 million people in the first Exodus, but here in this return from exile there were only about 100,000 returning, at least in the first stage. And what they find there, a lack of infrastructure, a lack of leadership. As we saw in Lamentations, morale is low, faith is hard to come by. So why are we looking at Ezra? Because it's really incredibly important that we'll find those three themes. We'll see God doesn't abandon his purposes. If he's made a promise, he's going to keep it. He never gives up on his people, no matter how bleak and desolate and stark things are. And thirdly, God gives light. He gives his word for the guidance of his people. Three truths that we desperately need to hear again today. And that's why we spend time looking at Ezra.